Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Listen First conversation. I'm Pierce Godwin, founder and president of Listen First Project. Today, we are bridging one of the widest gulfs in America, the caricature stereotypes of Southern conservatives and San Francisco liberals. We are fortunate to have three of each joining us to model civil discourse for a nation that desperately needs it. This conversation is sponsored by Listen First Project, which facilitates greater understanding, respect, and cooperation by encouraging the timeless but abandoned practice of listening to each other, especially to those with whom we disagree. And by Living Room Conversations, which offers an open source format to facilitate structured conversations among people of differing views and backgrounds to revitalize civil discourse. Today's conversation is produced by Sabrina Moyle, Jamie Gardner, and me. The idea of these Listen First living room conversations is to have people come together to get to know one another in a more meaningful way, to move beyond slander and seek common ground with a new respect and appreciation for different perspectives. Participants practice being open and curious about all perspectives with a focus on learning from one another rather than simply trying to debate the topic at hand. The great thing is that anyone can host these conversations, and many have done so across the country. Ideally, two friends host together. We hope folks watching will be inspired to participate in and host one themselves. We've asked all the participants to follow several conversation guidelines. These include come curious with an open mind, ready to learn and grow. Fully listen to and consider the other's views before sharing your own. Listen as you want to be listened to. Be fully present rather than thinking of how to respond. Show respect and suspend judgment. Look for common ground and appreciate differences. And finally, be authentic and welcome that from others. Let's get this conversation started first by getting to know each other. As we go around on the first question, share your name and then tell us what sense of purpose or mission guides you. We'll start with Sabrina.
My name is Sabrina Moyle. I live in San Francisco. And the mission and purpose that guides me in my life is really centered around my three children. I have three young sons who are 7, 7, and 4. And ever since I became a parent, I am trying to model for them both responsible and respectful behavior, being kind and caring, as well as kind of shepherding and being a good steward for the resources that we have as a family. And so that sense of mission is what guides me. I try to have it inform every interaction that I have, trying to listen, trying to be kind and open, trying to help those in need. I teach Sunday school. I am involved in several nonprofit organizations, and I try to be a really positive role model for my children. And so that is what gets me up every morning.
Beautiful. Thanks, Sabrina. Caroline, tell us what mission or purpose drives you.
I'm Caroline McCracken. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, but I'm currently going to be a senior at Duke University. And I'd say my purpose or mission that drives me is really to positively influence others. Starting at camp, I went to camp for, I think, 13 to 14 years. And that's really where I got the sense of wanting to lead by example, be a good role model. And with that comes listening and being open-minded, seeing new perspectives, meeting new people and learning from them. So I think I try in every interaction and everything I do at school, out of school, in the community, I try to really just be a positive role model and positively influence others.
Awesome. Charles.
Charles Robinson here. The mission and vision that really guides me is deep connections. That's something that I feel for myself that guides me with anything that I do. I really want to figure out ways that I can establish those deep connections, but also outside of just spending time, but being vulnerable and authentic. And especially within the social media age that we're living in now, very few people are open to doing that. And then the ones that are not open to doing that, it can make people feel like they're not living up to their full potential. So that's part A. And then part B is trying to help just myself, but even with my kids, I have 3 kids as well, having self-awareness and being okay with who you believe yourself to be, and walking that out. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Charles. Amy, how about you?
For me, I would say 100% hands down, my faith shapes everything that I believe, not just about this world, but about how to act, how to live. I am a follower of Jesus Christ, I would say. And so I do believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God. And I seek to orient my entire life around that, and not just in a way that is religious necessarily, but in a way that truly is a reaction to what I believe is good news. The good news about Jesus Christ, that he came and died. He paid the penalty of my sins and rose again. And that out of that, not that I'm required necessarily to follow a strict set of rules, but that I have freedom. And it's my natural inclination, out of my love for the Lord and what he's done for me, to glorify him by honoring him in my actions and reactions to people in this world. And so that's a big answer that kind of just shapes everything that at least I try to say and do. So yeah, that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you. Abby, what sense of purpose or mission guides you?
Hi, everybody. I'm Abby. I'm from San Francisco, Bay Area, because I'm actually an Oakland native, and that's where I live now. And I'm a mother of 2 little girls. And for me, I think that I define my purpose and mission is investing in community. And I define that community quite closely as, my immediate family, my neighborhood, my city, and then the groups of people that I can connect with and work with to further what I think is positive work in the world.
Awesome. Debbie, how about you?
Hi, my name is Davy. I live in San Francisco. I originally grew up in Southern California, and I would say my mission is to really live and be grounded on this planet for my soul's highest evolution. Having grown up in Southern California, fairly materialistic and conservative, I really didn't have much communication or relationship with my spirit. And now that I've found yoga and various lineages and healing practices, I'm finding that my mission now is to share this knowledge with others, for those that too have lost touch with their spirit.
Thank you. What incredible personal answers. Everybody has a story, and I want to hear more about that. And instead of just going around, let's whoever feels like speaking, go ahead, and we'll all make it. What was a defining moment in your life when you determined your political philosophy? Who would like to go first?
I'd be happy to chime in, Pierce.
Thanks,
So I grew up in overseas in Asia. My mom is from Taiwan and my dad's from Minnesota, and we actually lived in communist China when I was in the 80s before it opened up to the West. So I think I grew up with a real recognition that complete government control is can lead to pretty great oppression. But then the flip side, we also lived in like Kuala Lumpur and third world countries that were developing with an intense energy, and I saw a lot of intense energy, particularly around capitalism. And then I also saw an intense poverty that resulted from a lack of social services too. So when I moved to the States when I was 15, what struck me about the United States was the intense consumer culture here, but also, I think living outside of the States, I felt like America has so much potential to be a great leader in the world and to both uphold the highest standards in terms of responsible action, as well as freedom and all the ideals that we were founded upon. But I found moving here that it seemed like it was kind of falling short in some regards. And the biggest thing that struck me initially was consumerism. So I guess how this has defined my own political views is that I tend to be quite centrist. I tend to see the value of good government, the value of sensible regulation, the value of having safety nets for folks. but also I see the incredible value of freedom, of free markets, of not being overburdened by a very sort of inefficient and or controlling administrative state, if you will. So I can see different sides, and that's part of why it pains me so much that our two parties are always at each other's throats and have become so polarized, because I can see that there's so much benefit to both perspectives. So that's what's informed my political views.
Yeah. Thanks, Sabrina. The defining moment in your life when you determined your political philosophy. Who would like to share next?
I can go off what Sabrina said. I just think it's interesting for me. I wouldn't say there's one defining moment, but like Sabrina was saying, because I'm from the South, I'm from Atlanta, but I do go to Duke, which is a very liberal college. I see both perspectives all the time, and see like the need. They're just so polarized, and I see their need for more of a middle ground. And so I tend to find myself in any situation, not like arguing, but like pushing for the other side, because I think then it makes my beliefs stronger, and it's also more challenging and fun. So I think one time I remember kind of solidifying my political beliefs or philosophy was when it was the first time I ever stood up to my dad and kind of like countered his conservative beliefs. And not that like I'm not super liberal or anything, but I do have differing viewpoints than him. And I think being able to do that and stand up for what I believe and not conform to what all my friends growing up believed and what my dad said, I don't know, kind of made me more confident in my viewpoints. And he also recepted it very well. So I think, yeah, that was definitely awesome for me.
Excellent. Who's next?
Well, I have to tell you, I don't think I can answer this question very well. And maybe that's because I'm still waiting for my defining moment. But I feel like there's just so much change going on within the two parties right now that I really can't even put myself in a box. I look at, Democrat, Republican, and when I'm, trying to register to vote, every time I'm in the DMV, they're like, do you want to change this? And I'm like, yeah, I do. Like every single time. So it's so hard because there are things that, I appreciate about both parties and things that I see as problematic within both parties. So much so that I really can't say that I even lean one way or the other. I think even in my head, no matter how politically informed I am at any given moment, I still have, some lack of clarity there where I'm still waiting, for the day that I can say firmly, yeah, I land on this side. And I don't know if that's, that's neither good nor bad, but that's just kind of where I am. I'm like, a defining moment. That seems like it'd be nice to have.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah,
I can go. Yeah. I remember maybe one of my first very politically aware moments was in the 80s when President Reagan chose to shut down a lot of hospitals that house people with mental illness. And that hit close to my family because my grandmother had worked as essentially like a nighttime janitor up in Sonoma in a facility that was helping people with mental illness. And it wasn't, she treated it as a very dignified job, even though by most people's standards, it wasn't a very dignified job. And I remember her talking about, what are these people going to do and who's going to take care of them and how could we just turn them out on the streets? And I think it was at that moment, like having that personal connection that really made me begin to look to government for how can we support people and help people. As an adult, I realized that our systems are very bloated, not very efficient. This idea that we can support everybody has gotten quite perverted and corroded over time, but I still hold a belief that as a country, we have a responsibility and a duty to help each other.
Sure.
Charles
or Davey, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go. My defining moments that influenced my political philosophy was really the times where my wife and I and my kids, we left and lived out in the Philippines, and seeing different cultures and seeing how people live together, how people interact together, and then seeing that even within my community, you know, in Florida where I'm from, and then in North Carolina where my family is growing now, and just connecting within the community there. I realized there is there are like 8, 9, 50 different ways that we can solve a particular problem, and depending on what someone's strong views are, it can be validated. So my philosophy, you know, can be libertarian at times. It can be liberal at times. It can be conservative at times. But I feel a lot of times when we have these conversations, where you lean one way or another is based off of what issue really is strong within your heart, that you feel that there needs to be some form of government involvement, and what solution do you think will help America in that particular issue. That's where you would kind of lean. So within my philosophy, I've taken the approach of understanding why someone leans one way or another, and what issues come out of that as we listen and have these living room conversations. Just trying to understand, like, what is it that really, what's the thing that bubbles up to the top, and your solution is going to lean you one way or another, and understanding that it's not an either or. It could be a both and, or it can be, you know, a either and this. So it's just it's so many different ways you can go about that thing. So that's how I approach it from my philosophy, and connecting with other people, and actually like living with them and having these conversations with them about just their life and the things that they've gone through. Because even when Abby mentioned about the closing of the hospital, like hearing that story, and then like trying to see like how that has affected her family, and just the pain that could have caused. And I know there's plenty of stories where people have the life that you can see and you can feel and you can hear and all that stuff, where it's like, oh, that makes sense. Like, we need to have this because this will help this group. And yeah, so that's a long answer, but I think it's just that's how I'm influenced with my political.
Thanks, Charles. Mm-hmm. Davey, we'd love to hear about a defining moment in your life when you determined your political philosophy.
I guess I would say I was a political science major in college, and that was when that was my defining moment of realizing I do not want much to do with it.
Unfortunately. I understand that.
So, you know, to be quite honest, I'm quite jaded, and the approach I take now is from within, from yourself first as an individual, and from there, the community. And I truly believe that at this point now, it's about bottom up. And there's, you know, even though we vote one way and then somehow someone else gets elected, and somehow we live in this paradigm of like something that we didn't even vote for as a collective. So it just feels like the system is currently very broken. And I think it's time that we bind and join together and support each other on this level to really make that change, and to restore faith in our system to execute the laws that we truly that are ethical and that we've truly voted upon. So right now I don't feel heard, and in the paradigm I would say I'm socially Democrat, but fiscally Republican or conservative, because I don't want to give these people my money because they're not using it in a way that I feel is comfortable. And I think through, you know, individually opening the Heart Center, then from there I can choose where I want to give. And through an open Heart Center, that comes very naturally, like wanting to help others and, you know, make all those social changes that are being really stifled, it feels like, these days.
Thanks, Davey. Let's get into some of those issues. And as Charles said, so many of us are driven in our political philosophy by the issues that we prioritize, by those that are closest to our hearts and closest to our experience. So again, whoever would like to share first, what issue do you most wish that we could solve together?
I'll start out. I think economic development is something that's really important and dear to my heart. And partially it's because there's just a disparity from an economic gap standpoint. There's a disparity from an access standpoint, where I think the polarization within the media comes at the fact that we're presented with this issue versus this issue and the other issues. And I think Davey mentioned this as well, and I'm glad she said it, was sometimes she just doesn't feel heard. And I'm pretty sure there are tons of Americans that just don't feel heard within the economic issue. And when we have the conversations about government involvement and a conservative approach versus a liberal approach, it's almost as if the two parties have taken what bubbles up for them as a solution and have removed the voices of the ones who actually need it. As far as my solution, I think there needs to be a limited involvement. So I take more of a conservative approach within that. I think entrepreneurship is especially within America as a capitalist country, that there are opportunities to leverage that. And a lot of those, tax dollars that we use can be going towards to funding these entrepreneurial endeavors, which a lot of times when you have these conversations, it can get pigeonholed into one thing, like, hey, we've been doing that. And I think from that perspective, I feel that we've looked at it from a media standpoint in the addition process. And I'll explain what that means. So we try to look at it like, hey, we've given someone opportunities to be an entrepreneur, and now we're looking for another entrepreneur. You're just adding entrepreneurs. Whereas we can invest into individuals who are looking to take it from concept to scale, where it's not just an individual that they're just looking at to give money to, but they're looking at to capacity build, so that it's a multiple process where that individual is now be able to create jobs. And anytime we talk about money, there's inequity. It just happens. And that's the piece of the system where, in the economic part, where I know that it's broken. It's not a think. I know that it's broken. It's, when we talk about money in the capitalist society, there are haves and there are have-nots, and that's just the way it is right now. And there are parts where I believe there are certain things we can solve within that, and then there are parts where I think it's just a matter that we just keep walking and we'll find it, but we're not going to find it through anecdotal pieces. We just have to take action and get people into the community. And I'm very much involved in the community and trying to, have these conversations about how do we truly build sustainable economic development through entrepreneurship. And it's not just a situation where you just build a business, a cleaning company or, lawnmower company, and that's sustainable income for you. Like, how do you build something that's capacity building, where that creates more jobs for people within your community? Not just looking at it like, how do you create this big conglomerate, but how do you create jobs within your neighborhood? How do you create jobs within your city? How do you create jobs within your region? How do you create jobs within your state, and then multinational and things like that? So that's my issue that really bubbles up for me. when it comes to economic development.
Mhm.
Well, it's what issue do you most wish we could solve together?
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's the issue I wish we could solve together. Is yeah.
Mm-hmm. Who else?
Equality for same-sex marriage, equality for women, minorities. And again, I think that starts with the self-worth and the self-work. The hate comes from fear, and fear stems from lack of self-love. So that's my solution. Everyone go work on themselves.
Well, and I'd love to dovetail onto that. I've been reading a great book called The Vanishing American Adult by Ben Sasse, who's a Republican senator from Nebraska. And a lot of what he talks about really resonates to me as kind of highlighting what I believe we could work together on, which is, what does it mean to be an adult in America? What are we trying to educate our children towards? And it has to do with work as well as education, sort of, what does it mean to be self-reliant, and I think part of the challenge is teaching people, our parents, having the bandwidth to be present with their kids and spend enough time with their kids to teach them self-love, tolerance, kindness, resilience, responsibility, grit, all these character traits, and having schools also be imparting those things, so that when our teenagers are adults, they're not tempted to boomerang back home. They're not playing video games all the time. I mean, there's just so much data out there. Plus, with the rise of automation, there's this threat to our economic well-being. And I kind of resonate with what Davey said and what others have said around spirituality and around a lot of these motivations and the cultivation needing to come from within, and all of this conflict in our culture. I often feel like, people, particularly on the Christian right, tend to seem like they're the only ones who are they're talking the loudest about character and culture and values and morals. But I think those are things that are universal, and that, folks from all across the spectrum and from different spiritual backgrounds as well can all relate to, and that we as a nation, it's kind of embedded in our values. So I think I would love to kind of have a conversation or engage people from all across the spectrum in a discussion of, what does it mean to be a productive American adult? And what are those values that we all aspire towards? And what does that look like when it comes to work? And work may or may not be paid work. It might be volunteer work, it might be parenting work. So I feel like there's a real, being an American is so tied up with the Protestant work ethic. We're so defined by our work in a way. And I think that's part of where some of the conflict around, oh, well, you're lazy, you don't work enough, kind of, there's conflict that comes in there. But I think we would probably all agree that as Americans, we need to be hardworking and entrepreneurial, no matter what our skin color, our socioeconomic background. How do we teach that? And then how do we define the spheres in which we work so that we feel a sense of dignity and self-respect, regardless of how much we're earning, how much we can afford to buy for ourselves? There's a deep spiritual component to it. Anyway, I rambled. I feel like it's not like a clear-cut thing that I wish we could work on together. It's more culture change than it is policy, but I feel like it's something that undergirds a lot of these vitriolic policy debates, is essentially a misunderstanding that, hey, we all want the same thing in terms of the character of a successful American citizen. So,
Absolutely.
And
we're talking about what issue you'd most wish we could solve together. Go ahead.
For me, the issue I think about a lot that I wish we could solve together is climate change. And really, I do believe in that 2050 being a demarcation line. And I think that there are so many actions that we can take nationally and internationally that would create a better planet for our children and grandchildren and beyond. And I think, I hear a lot of the contention gets tied up in jobs, and that addressing climate change means that a certain group of people will lose their jobs. But somebody told me once the analogy of the pie maker versus the pie cutter. And a pie cutter is somebody who looks at the pie and sees only the pie and is trying to like slice it up into as many little pieces as possible so that everybody gets a little something. Whereas the pie maker says, but we can make more pies, and look at the pie that can be made, and has this very expansive way of looking at issues. And so I think we do have an opportunity to step into more of a pie maker mindset and look at the ways that we can address people's concerns and create more opportunity through a polarized issue.
Great.
A big issue for me is a big issue is immigration for me, and even kind of reaching beyond that. What do we do in terms of refugees? I find it deeply disturbing that anyone would have to live in this country in fear for their own personal safety. I think that's a really, really concerning issue that's going on, that people are fearing, for their lives in some instance, getting kicked out, being hated. I just think there's so much there that's really upsetting. It's not something that I pretend to have the answers for. I think the whole topic of immigration is so much more complicated than even I understand. But having, distant relatives that are being faced with threats of deportation is really scary and really concerning. I think even for young people, that's not the America they should have to grow up in. And again, I don't know what the solution is, but I think there has to be a better conversation around that topic.
Absolutely.
So I think the issue for me that's really been important is increasing access to opportunity for children, for all children, in terms of education and just their futures. Like I said, I was a camp counselor, and I also volunteer a lot at the Community Empowerment Fund in Durham. And I've just seen the way that children, that they don't deserve their position in life. Like, no child deserves to be born in a billionaire family. No child deserves to be born in a very poor family. And you can say that all children have equal opportunity if they work hard and whatnot, but in reality, they really don't. And I think that all sides can agree that something could be done in terms of education. I don't know the solution, but programs or whatnot, I just see that as like not even having all children be on an equal playing field, but giving them some basis of like having them see a bright future for themselves, not automatically growing up and seeing this one vision of them ending up exactly how their parents have ended up, or not having any mobility at all. I think is really important.
Great point. So now, what is some perspectives on some of the issues that you've talked about, that another person has identified? And tell us also, in sharing your view, what experiences have informed that perspective. Let's dive into a couple of these.
I don't think I understand the question. Can you do it again?
Yeah, so we're just going to dive into some of the topics that folks have raised as most important to them. So if you want to discuss more your own topic that tends to drive you and your political philosophy that you most wish we could solve together, or if somebody else mentioned one that you'd love for this group of Southern conservatives and San Francisco liberals to try to wrap our minds around and broaden our perspectives on. What topic stood out to anyone?
I would love to hear more about Abby's perspective on climate change. I think she tapped on something I wanted to hear a little more about, her philosophy about climate change, and because I've heard a lot about it, and I've heard both sides of it, and I don't even understand a lot of what's going on. So I think just hearing more about what is the issue about climate change that's causing this debate, and then just trying to see your perspective of the solution within that as well. I would love to hear that.
Sure. And I'll tell you, I'm not the most scientific person in the world, so I'm going to tell it to you my layperson way.
Okay.
Perfect.
I don't if you did go science, I wouldn't understand.
So you know what I'm understanding is that our world is heating up, and as the world heats up, it has different things that happen as a result of that. So we've heard about icebergs melting, and so then that, you know, we're taking away those resources. Also, as the planet heats up, the ocean molecules are swelling a little bit. So we get these rising sea levels. So when we look at kind of where people are living, we're starting to see evidence of what are being called climate refugees, right? So islands are starting to every year, a little bit more water, a little bit more water, a little bit more water. And then there are going to be whole pods of people who have to completely relocate. And you already see this happening a lot in Bangladesh in particular, and in the South Pacific. And so that, I mean, that's on the international level. You know, locally, I think that the United States, where we've created a whole series of economies that release an awful lot of carbon into the environment, carbon and methane and other gases. And it feels, my interpretation is it feels threatening to those industries to ask them to behave differently than how they're behaving now. So agribusiness with cattle, or if you're looking at heavy manufacturing with everything that's getting emitted. And so there's a lot of resistance to shifting practices because it would require large-scale systems change. But if those systems changes were put in place, then it could potentially help the planet and create new opportunities for people. So in California, when I got into my career, there was a lot going on about green jobs, and that green jobs were going to be the solution for the future, and that everybody was going to get employed. And speaking of economic development, in urban centers like Oakland and Richmond, there was huge promise that green jobs were going to be able to reach particularly a lot of young men and women of color who hadn't necessarily gone to college, but could be trained as solar engineers, that could be trained to do all kinds of interesting work. And that we're seeing that start to come online in a way that's really significant. And so if you look at even just like a microcosm of a small city, if everybody decided to put solar on their roofs, then that creates a whole bunch of jobs, right? Then people are using energy differently, and you have a positive story. But the thing is like we're talking about such huge scale systems change that it's really difficult for it to scale. But I think a lot about what could we do, like little and big, that would make a difference. And so that's why I find this to be a fascinating topic. And if I misrepresented any of your understanding of climate change, I would love to hear from you, and I won't be defensive about it.
No, I think that's really really interesting. You said like the small versus the big changes, because whenever I think about climate change, and like solutions towards it and creating these jobs using greener energy, it sounds so great, and like I'm all for it. My thought, I don't know, I always think about like the collective action problem almost of like, I would love to make these individual changes, and I would love for my city to make these individual changes, and I just don't know the science behind it, but how many people need to make those changes for it to have an impact? And I don't know, that's just one thing I always think about when I think about solutions to climate change. But I don't know if you know anything about that, but I just think it's interesting.
I think that there are a lot of different ways to approach the problem. And I really like Van Jones put out kind of the theory where it's like you've got your air game, which is like all the policy, you've got your ground game, which is like getting everybody who can like take small actions, and you've kind of got your side games over here, which are more the corporations and the investors. And like if people could start coordinating a bit more, like we have a game and we could shift forward on it.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think collective action is such a problem in America. I mean, for crying out loud, we have so much trouble getting people to actually go vote that, if, people aren't going to be compelled to even vote, how much more work are you going to have to do to get people to care enough to take action on something? And at what point is that helpful or not? I remember I was at a conference a couple years ago for a big church. It was the Passion Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. And the leader was talking about human trafficking and different big corporations overseas that employ child laborers. And what a horrible situation that is. And his suggestion was everybody stop buying from these companies. And he named a few. And I mean, I think the biggest one that stuck out in my head was your cell phones. And I thought that's so interesting. You know, there are 40,000 people at this conference. And if you're ever going to move people to collective action, it's probably going to be millennials when you have 40,000 of them together and they're persuaded by what their peers are doing. And they're all right there at part of this big emotional conference. So the strategy is great. But then I wondered, wait a minute, you've listed off 3 or 4 really big name companies. Now I feel like you're suggesting I don't have a phone. So I don't know what to do with that. If there's so many problems that they seem insurmountable, and like even if 40,000 people up and decide not to buy a phone, even then, is that going to make a difference? It can be really discouraging. But I think you're right. And, you know, at least identifying that we do have a collective action problem, and it goes far beyond just, you know, 1 or 2 issues. I think it's really plaguing our American politics in a whole bunch of facets.
Yeah. I love what, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm listening.
I love what Abby said about the different chunking it out into different strategies. I think that any type of behavior change really is identifying just small behavior changes, whether it's at the corporate level or investor level or policy level. You know, instead of fighting about black and white, like climate change does exist or it doesn't exist, let's maybe just talk about small actions we can take at different levels to see, test, and iterate. You know, I agree. The collective action problem, it can feel overwhelming, but I think if we could agree on small actions, that would make a difference. Mm-hmm. On climate change, I also just want to add, like, that's an issue that's important to me as well. It does feel like a big, huge systems issue. So it can feel really daunting to know what to do about it, if anything, and it feels overwhelming. But all I do know is that regardless of what you believe, or how I feel anyways, regardless of what I might know or believe about the science, like whether or not climate change is just it's part of a natural fluctuation or not. What I do know is that this is our only planet. This is, you know, I'm an evangelical Christian. I believe that this is, you know, God created this beautiful earth for us to inhabit and to create his vision on earth. And I don't want to squander that, you know, and I feel like it takes us as human beings, you know, interacting with our faith to do the right thing. And the kids are super into astronomy, and we look at images of other planets in the solar system. That is a vast, inhospitable place that we are so delicately, fragilely placed in. You know, I just personally don't believe that it's worth the downside risk of ignoring, of taking no action. So then the question is, like, what action do you take? And I just think that small actions are indeed where it's at, because I also do believe the market has a really important role to play in terms of just using market forces are already doing a lot to combat climate change as it is.
I'm so encouraged just seeing how many people are watching this Listen First conversation right now between Southern conservatives and San Francisco liberals. We have hundreds with us at the moment. Over 6,000 people have tuned in and watched some of the conversation you all are having. It's been shared by the Harvard program on negotiation and mediation. It's been shared by the Coffee Party movement and Bridge the Divide as well. And thank you so much to all of the commenters. I want to reiterate something that one of our co-sponsors and producers, Jamie Gardner, has shared. She said, for commenters, please notice when you turn to judging instead of listening. Try to have an open heart and mind. So thank you so much to everybody who's watching this and joining us around the table for this Listen First conversation. What other issues that have been raised, or any new ones that have come to mind, would you all like to discuss?
So, you know, seeing how my family, the economic status is can be a huge burden on like what you really want and how you want to walk on this planet consciously versus the discrepancy between that and survival when you don't have the resources economically to sustain by eating organic produce, or, you know, like the Walmarts of the nation. It's like, yeah, these items are built from child labor, but hey, they're cheap and I can afford it. So I think, you know, like really thinking about, well, how do we make that shift? I think it really does come from conscious beings that, you know, the investors that have that dinero to make that happen, because I think as the gap gets wider and wider in terms of wages, like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and some people just straight up can't afford to buy organic food, or can't afford to. It's not affordable quite yet to be sustainable. You have to make changes to put those solar panels up, and maybe in that case we have the government subsidize that and really make that shift. But it feels like to me that will really have to come from top down, because it's not really something that people from the bottom up can afford to do.
You mean, and just it's a question. So when you say they can't afford, are you saying they can't afford to purchase those foods, or are you saying they can't afford to like grow them themselves? I'm just wanting to make
Correct.
sure I understand.
Like low income, that they can go. It's both. It's both like lack of education, lack of knowledge of knowing how to do it, but also the convenience of getting fast food, getting something dirt cheap that's not necessarily great for the body, great for the environment. But to survive in this fast-paced Western society, to quote unquote keep up, we've been imprisoned by this facade of what we should be doing, and constantly being bombarded with advertisements about, well, look what else you don't have. And so that just perpetuates that, like, well, I got to keep working and I got to do it fast. And, we slowly I feel, from what I've seen, really lost ourselves in that. But I also see a shift of people really coming back to it and realizing, like, whoa, I'm really unhappy here. And it kind of takes a drastic rock bottom to get to that point. I know I've experienced that myself, where I just felt so empty inside, and consuming, getting the latest, and like, I have all these things that the world is telling me I want, yet I'm feeling so empty. And so now I'm taking a different approach, but at the same time, as much as I'd like to be consciously conscious every step of the way, sometimes it's just unaffordable. I can't go buy an electric car right now.
And Davey, what I'm hearing you say too is that often we have arguments around free markets and how efficient they are, and how that can lift everyone potentially, but that there are often people who maybe don't have the choice of making a different decision within a marketplace because they are limited by their circumstances, or they can't travel to a different store or whatever it is. They don't have the financial means to participate in the market. Maybe they're stuck in a particular market segment.
Right. They can't speak with their money because they don't have a choice. Thank you. That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Gotcha. And I definitely agree in that as well, especially within our free market. And I think education is one of the things that I've heard come across a lot of spectrums. And it seems like there's education on economic issues, there's education on health, there's education from climate change. And one of the things that just for me, from an education standpoint, is realizing that the institutions of education, whether it's a university setting or a high school or a middle school or wherever that is, like, the internet is really it's more so access of how do you get to that information, and just typing it up in YouTube and social media and all of those things. I think there are great opportunities where we can leverage technology to even what we're doing now is a form of education, where people are listening in and hearing these different perspectives. And I think one of the things that we can do to address a lot of the different issues that we all have within our sphere of influence, that we see within our lens, as we expand that, is using technology to educate. Because there are things that Davey, that you've experienced in life and shared with the whole rock bottom thing that you mentioned, that people may have hit or hitting rock bottom that may be looking at us right now and just trying to figure out, like, how do I get out of this? Or how do I start my own garden? How do I like eat healthy? How do I cut this habit of going to McDonald's for Egg McMuffins every morning? Something like that. Those Egg McMuffins, I tell you.
Personal experience. We talked about sharing personal experiences in your perspective. I think Charles just did.
I'm totally joking. Like I definitely try to eat healthy. If my wife's watching this, if my wife's watching this, definitely try to eat healthy. No, but I think the education piece as well is we can, as a group, think of creative ways where everybody can be educated. And I think about the rural areas in America, and I also think about the urban areas in America, where those two polarizing locations, where there are underserved communities in both sides of that equation, where they may not have access. I think that's where we can, and once again, this is like 9 ways that you can go about it. So I'm not pigeonholing it, saying this is the only way, but I think as we talk about these things, because this morning I was, in a meeting with a group that talked about, commercial real estate, talked about different forms of like economic development, things like that. And what came up was education. Like, how do we educate? How do we get people to learn? And for the ones that have access to a computer or a library system, that's even difficult because you may not have transportation. So there's so many hurdles and things that we can try to figure out how we can work together. But I think the big underlining piece of a lot of issues is education. And I think that we can use / leverage the technology to get that information to those, for example, eating healthy and the importance of eating healthy and not feeling like it's like, seriously, like my wife is extremely an extremely healthy person, eater, etc. And it's just very inconvenient sometimes for me to go down that path. And I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people who are similar to me when it comes to wanting to eat that, eating the nuts and raisins versus, eating chips, which is just $1, where the nuts and raisins is like $6. And I think the economic piece of it can be a turnoff. And I don't know how we can shift that needle without having the companies lose from a margin standpoint. Because at the end of the day, we are living in a free market economy, but then also how do we educate people to work within that system or try to work around that system?
Makes total sense. Charles, I'd love to key in on one thing you raised, because Sabrina and I and the other sponsors and producers, Jamie and others, have talked about having conversations. So right now we're doing coast to coast, right? Those caricatured stereotypes of the Southern conservative and the San Francisco liberal, it never gets old. We've also talked about the dichotomy between the rural and the urban citizen that you raised, Charles. And I look forward to doing that sometime soon. But any thoughts on how that location? I mean, some of you, I'm sure, have heard of the big sort. We are all sorting ourselves for one reason or another over the last several decades into tribes of like mind. It's pretty unlikely that we have somebody who looks differently and thinks differently living next door to us these days. Across the country, by and large, you're seeing the data around how much folks would be troubled by their child marrying someone of the other party. I mean, perish the thought. So let's talk about that a little bit, especially around rural and urban. Any thoughts, especially where folks grew up who are a part of this conversation?
And what was the question in regards to when you said a part of the conversation exactly?
Yeah, the idea in this dichotomy of whether you're living in a rural area or an urban area. There are a number of books that came out, J.D. Vance with Hillbilly Elegy, which kind of shone a light from his own experience growing up on the white working class person. And certainly a lot of study has been done in the urban environment as well. But any perspectives that some of you might have based on your own upbringing, your friends, folks you know at college, about how this big sort into urban and rural manifests itself in our ideologies, in our polarization, in our tribalization.
I'll say something. I think this piece, especially when I think about economic development from the rural and urban side, like, we have these conversations, but very rarely someone from the rural community or the urban community that we're talking about actually have a voice. And like we are afforded an opportunity to have access to talk about it, but neither one of us are living in rural or urban in a sense of in the polarized way that I'm thinking about it. I'm pretty sure somebody is, who's listening, or even us, I don't know the living situations that you have right now. But when I think about it from the polarizing standpoint, I think about the person that's living out in the sticks that don't have electricity, and you definitely won't have a phone signal there. And my wife and I were actually in Washington County last week, visiting some friends, and it's just a different perspective. It's a different world. And then I visit some friends over in East Durham, which is in North Carolina. It's close to downtown, and a lot of times for myself, when I have these conversations, very rarely someone who actually is living in that community, who is experiencing the issues and the difficulties of paying, their bills versus getting access to, jobs versus getting access to the education materials that I was talking about, have opportunities to sit at that table. And I think one of the big things that we can do together in regards to that polarizing piece is really figure out a way, how do we actually get them to the table as well? And not coming into their community saying, this is the way you need to do it, but coming in from a consultative approach saying, like, tell us what's going on, tell us the best way that you feel it to work. And then we can think of ways that we can solve those problems together. But then also there are some pieces where, to be efficient, there has to be some form of decisions to be made initially, and then we can work through that. So it's one of those things that it sounds great, as we sit down and we talk about it and have these kind of conversations, but we also have to think about the efficiency piece. Is like, how do we actually get to these groups of people, and how do we actually solve the problems that happen on these polar opposite communities?
Yeah.
I would just offer, I think that even with social media, we're still increasingly more siloed than we think.
Yes.
And after the election, I was visiting with someone who was in charge of a super PAC, and they were showing footage that they had run and trying to understand how Hillary lost and Trump won. And they had some focus groups with different groups of women in the Midwest, specifically outside of Detroit, and outside somewhere around Minneapolis. And they were asking the women about what they'd heard about the Women's March. And each of the women in these focus groups said, I don't know what you're talking about. Because their social media chambers were, we get so siloed, right? And so, where as a West Coast liberal woman, I thought everyone and their mother knew about the Women's March and was show up in some capacity, to see a whole group of women just say, what are you talking about, right? And it just shows you how news gets siloed in our country right now.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. A fascinating study was done in the days following what took place in Ferguson. And you can see this visual of a red cluster and a blue cluster, and ne'er shall they cross. And just unbelievable to see that the way in which we are talking to people who look like us and think like us, we're never having our ideas questioned or challenged. So of course, people of a different perspective just seems crazy, inconceivable. I don't understand how you could disagree with me, because everything I've heard, every fact that has been presented to me has supported my perspective. And you can see a lot of this research that's been done on exactly the issue you're talking about on the Listen First website, listenfirstproject.org. And we have whole features on polarization, and then wisdom and quotes around listening. You'll see what I'm talking about with that study that was done. So we see it in our everyday lives. We see it scientifically and empirically proven. What can we do about it?
I think it's interesting when we talk about segmenting ourselves off into little pockets of people that look like us, and how we're a lot more polarized, even on social media, and isolated from other viewpoints than we think. On one hand, it's kind of scary that we can do that at such close proximity geographically. But on the other hand, I think it's really neat and provides a really cool opportunity that I only have to drive, right where I live. I'm in between Raleigh and Durham, North Carolina. And, I live in happy little suburbia. But it's just kind of interesting, and I think really cool. One of the things I enjoy is, 20 minutes down the road, I'm in Raleigh, 20 minutes down the road, I'm in Durham. Right. And even less than that, there's a pocket of some people down the road that, live in a community that's predominantly Indian, and their life experiences, their perspectives on politics and religion are totally different than mine. And so, yeah, it concerns me a little bit that we're able to, segment ourselves off from that group of people that's 5 or 10 minutes down the road so easily without even really thinking about it. But I do think it provides a really great opportunity that I don't have to go all the way out to the boonies necessarily to find somebody who thinks differently than I do. I could. My in-laws live in the boonies. There's plenty of opportunity for conversations there. But I think it really just takes reaching out, having a conversation. And I think it's really cool and gives me hope that I can do that down the street or at the mall on a weekend, that even walking around the mall, I'm going to interact and pass by so many different people that may live 20 minutes away, may live 2 minutes away, that in some way, I wouldn't necessarily seek out on my own instinctively.
Right. I often say, it starts with me and it starts with you, but for whatever reason, I'm not doing it like I should. And I'd love for somebody who's doing a good job to tell me all about that. But we're busy. We're scared. We don't want our ideas challenged because maybe instinctively we aren't as secure as we'd like to portray when we're chanting, when we're writing it on a sign. And we're scared by that kind of challenge. Yeah, Sabrina.
I'd love to just piggyback on Charles, what Charles said about how do we scale this, like the urban rural, how do we leverage technology? And I really feel like schools are a key place. K-12 education is still mandatory, and I think what we need to be teaching kids is how to learn, and also how to learn experientially and leverage technology in their learning. And so if we could have schools that are rural and urban partnering with each other, forming study groups that are across these different divides, somehow connecting using technology with their curriculum so that people get into the habit of understanding they can learn from their peers who have different perspectives, and also, drive their own learning and figure out how they themselves learn, in addition to kind of all the character education I was talking about earlier, and that being really central to in education these days, because knowledge is just a commodity. Anyone can Google any information they need to. And obviously media literacy is a key piece too, in terms of being able to discern what's good information versus bad online. But I don't know, I feel like that's a really huge opportunity. And I know that Living Room Conversations with All Sides, which is a news site where you can see perspectives from left, right, and center, has a program that I think is in like 40 some odd states called Relationships First, where in classrooms, they're getting kids together in conversations like this, in living room conversations, to read the news and then talk about it and listen to each other from different perspectives. So I feel like that's an amazing start. And maybe if we could then leverage technology to take that out from within one school to connecting different schools in different states and different rural, urban communities, that could be one way that we start helping people break down the divides and also open up their own horizons in terms of how to learn.
I love that idea. That's the first time I've heard of that hybrid approach, taking that and putting it in the existing school system versus just doing away with it and doing your own thing on the side. Because I think you're right, where we can, if we can figure out a way to put technology, not technology in the schools, but the use of technology within the school systems, where you can take that as you learn how to learn. I love that term you use, as we learn how to learn, giving them the tools that they can take it outside of the time when they're in school, where they're continuously learning. And I think that works on both ends, from the student standpoint, but then also it's an education piece for the parents. Because a lot of times, when they're in school, it's either what the teacher is telling them versus what the kids are telling the parents. And sometimes the parents have to, if you have not had any affiliation with the school system, whether your parents were teachers or you had family members who were teachers, some people just don't know. They just think like, hey, I'm sending my kid out there, and then they come back and then they do whatever the teachers told them. But if the school system can actually provide that technology, which you were mentioning, where they can say, hey, you can just go on to Google, or you can go on to, whatever the other search engines that you can use, and just type up, a few of these things and look on videos on YouTube on how to do different things, or go on to, Twitter, or go on to Instagram, or go on to Snapchat. And you can actually look up these things, like come to things like this and listening on live to hear these different perspectives and ideas. Because I'm pretty sure there's some teachers that are probably listening now that heard that idea and think like, hey, maybe we can approach that differently. So I think that's awesome idea, and thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Charles, while you're talking, we have a lot of agreement going on right now. That's a beautiful thing. I'd like to challenge us a little bit more. Charles, when you spoke earlier about entrepreneurship, Brandy Nicole, one of our viewers, said universal healthcare would allow more entrepreneurs to go for it. Many people are afraid to make a career move because of lack of affordable insurance. As we know, the healthcare issue has dominated the last several years in our political discourse, and there's a lot of movement happening right now in Congress. So, Charles, if you want to speak to the entrepreneurship, and then more broadly, what are our thoughts on healthcare from the East Coast to the West Coast?
Sure. So, does she want, speaking on entrepreneurship in regards to the question that was raised, or in regards to affordable healthcare?
Sure. Brandy's point was universal healthcare would allow more entrepreneurs to go for it. So you can speak to that specifically, or just dovetail where you like.
Well, I'll speak to that, because I think that's what this is for, like having that and thank you, Brandy, for those comments. And I think that's great that she shared her opinion. I'll start by saying this. There is no one right way, one wrong way. Like I said before, there are 9 ways to solving that problem. For me, I would say Brandy has some validity in that, having some form of universal healthcare, but I don't think that is necessarily the reason why businesses succeed or fail is because of healthcare. As an entrepreneur, I think the holy grail when it comes to business is cash flow. And some people may, whatever issues bubble up, like I said before, whatever issues bubble up, they'll say, well, the cash flow problem is my cash flow is going towards insurance that is not being provided to me in a universal way. I get that. But from a business standpoint, as an entrepreneur, you can say that healthcare would help out, but how are you building a sustainable pipeline of customers where you can afford that? I do understand within the most recent form of healthcare where employers are required to provide healthcare for their employees, and the employees that work with them may not have access to healthcare. So I get that side of it as well. But as far as the entrepreneur piece, I don't believe that universal health care would necessarily solve the problem, or I wouldn't even say the problem, the statistic that half of businesses that start fail within 2 years. And then after that, you can see incrementally the next 2 years after that, it just drops off and it continues to drop off. And why is that? I wouldn't say that it's because they don't have universal health care is the reason. But I believe, to her point, I could be misinterpreting it, more people may feel the need to take the risk. And this is just me being transparent and honest, is I think people are afraid to take the risk regardless of whether it's healthcare or not. And that's the thing. We just make excuses about why we can't do something. And there's this cool life hack. I always talk about it. Like, if you really want to know how your brain functions when you want to do something, and if you guys want to try this, is really, I do this like every morning. Like, you go in the morning, as soon as you wake up, go to the shower, turn it on extremely cold. Like, as like warm, then there's cold, and then there's like hypothermia cold. Like, turn your shower on hypothermia cold, let it run for like a minute or two, and then like get your clothes, all that stuff, and get ready to get into that shower, right? And the people who are listening, like, try this out. You'll notice there's this internal dialogue that's happening. Like, man, like, how long am I going to stay in this? Like, am I just going to get my feet wet? And you'll step in, you'll get your feet wet. And it's like, oh my gosh, I'm definitely not going to put this water on my back. Like, so you start thinking about, I say this because you start thinking about reasons why you shouldn't do this. And I don't believe there's no reason on this planet why you should not do something. There's no reason why you shouldn't try. Now, I understand there are debilitating things that is difficult. And I'm not saying that certain groups and communities have it easier than others. I know that's there. I know that it's easier for certain communities. I know there's easier for certain people. I know there's easier for certain friends. Like, I get it. But for them to say that I can't do this because it's not there, I think it's a cop-out. And I say this all the time, like, anyone who really wants to try to do something and start and they feel like it's universal healthcare, really send me a message, DM me directly. I will, for free. Like, I'll have a 10-minute conversation with you to talk about concept to scale and literally get you to start without having the universal healthcare. Now, the universal healthcare issue, there are so many different ways, like I said before, to skin that cat. But as far as not doing something as an entrepreneur, that's just a cop-out.
Yeah. Charles, I want to acknowledge your transparency and your candor, but also your humility. Note that Charles did not assume necessarily where Brandy was coming from. He said, hey, I might be misinterpreting what she's saying, but here's how what I hear and what I would say to that. So thanks for that humility, and everybody's demonstrating that. Yeah, Sabrina.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of chime in on that. I'm a small business owner and started a small business when I was in my 20s. And, I think having the key thing to starting a small business and being able to take that risk is to have some sort of safety net, and it's having the cash potentially to get that started, because cash flow is a really key thing. So I think the bigger issue more is, if we want more entrepreneurs in our country, we need to give them access to capital, to startup capital. And there's folks who can do that. Like, I was lucky to be able to rely on friends and family money, but there's organizations like Kiva, where you can do micro lending to low income folks. That to me is really promising. So I agree with Charles that if you're going to start a business, nothing should get in your way, because it's really tough work. You've got to freaking work day and night. If healthcare is keeping you from doing it, then you're not going to have a successful business. I mean, that might sound really harsh, but it's like there are going to be so many challenges thrown your way that if that is the thing stopping you, then maybe you should reconsider. But again, that may sound really, really harsh, but that is kind of how I feel as an entrepreneur. It's really difficult. But others on healthcare more broadly, though, I would say I love the fact that the Obamacare allowed people up to 26 to be covered by their parents, because I think a lot of entrepreneurs are young, and that was actually a way to help give them support during those years when they might be able to take a risk and not have a family to support, and thus, start a business. And then finally on healthcare, I feel like, I'm personally a proponent of universal healthcare, of on some sort of catastrophic level, I feel like the greater issue in our country is just that we spend way too much, that our system is way too bloated, and our outcomes are not good enough. And we should be able to do better. And that should be a bipartisan area of bipartisan agreements. I feel like we should have universal coverage on a catastrophic level for everyone, and that we should be able to make the system more efficient through a combination of markets and other forces. And finally, as a small business owner, it is hard to have to be forced to supply healthcare. So I do feel like it's a challenge making the company and the business be the one that's responsible for providing healthcare. I'd love to see that that burden being taken off of businesses personally.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I'm not an entrepreneur. I can't plan to know about how that works. But as an employee, I find it interesting that when companies and corporations are tasked with the burden of providing the healthcare, it can sometimes stifle their business, even if cash flow is not an issue. I know this because of personal experience. The organization I work for has expressed interest. Right now I work part-time, and that they would love to have me full-time, and that it's not that they don't have the money to pay me. They have that cash flow, but the minute I become a full-time employee, they can't afford to pay me benefits because they just can't. So it's not necessarily a cash issue because I could pay the salary and there's enough, cash to spread around. But when they are tasked with providing healthcare for every full-time employee, it limits the number of full-time employees they can have. Even if I, signed a contract saying, I'm fine if you don't offer me benefits, I would be okay with that. That's not something that they can legally do right now. I just could see that being problematic. If, you have a small business, it can be hard to grow that business with more full-time employees if you're bearing the burden of providing those benefits.
Great point. We have just crossed the 10,000 viewer mark. So you all are modeling civil discourse for people all over the country and all over the world. What an incredible conversation. I want to especially thank the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program. They just tweeted out this conversation. So you all are really providing something for the world to see and for the world to model. It starts one conversation at a time. We've got about 15 minutes left. Any other thoughts on healthcare or other burning topics that, while we have Southern conservatives and San Francisco liberals gathered together in a listen first living room conversation, what would you all like to hear more of?
Well, I'm surprised that, and I'm not sure if it's because you picked us in a particular way, but we all seem to be like listening really well to each other and not really directly kind of disagreeing about anything. And then
take us there, Abby. Let's directly disagree.
I'm conflict adverse. That's why I'm on this call, because I want to listen.
Well, I think also what's happening is like, this is Facebook Live, just being 100. Like, I think this is Facebook Live, and we know a lot of people are saying we just hit the 10,000 mark, and everybody wants to put on the best foot forward. And the thing is, I could even tell like from the intro that it was going to be that way. It was like everyone was kind of like teeter-tottering in the middle and things like that, and that's okay. But I think the more and more we have these conversations, that will allow that. And I think the piece as well that will be helpful is just having the comments of the people who are watching and then putting that in, because that actually is where the people, they have no skin in the game. They can just put that in there, and it's like, it'll force us to actually speak to those things, to speak to those things that are really passionate about us. Because I think what we've done thus far, we've shared what's most important to us, and we came from that perspective. But typically when we have those clashings, you're not sharing it from a perspective as an individual, you're sharing it from a perspective as a party. And usually that party controls that dialogue. And when you share it from that perspective, from a party perspective, then it's like, I'm fighting for this party and you're fighting for this party. But let's be honest, there's some things within the party that you may not agree with. There's some things in the party that I may not agree with, but we're just fighting on the party standpoint. And then we talk about the issues that are important to us within that party. And then it's like, well, I don't really care about that. This is what I care about. And it's like, okay, well, we have no reason to argue because that doesn't really bother me that much in certain things. But I think healthcare is definitely a polarizing thing. And I've as an entrepreneur, as well from, and I've worked with tons of organizations from the small to the big. I've definitely seen the spectrum of the cash flow problem from a standpoint of, if you have the cash flow to bring an employee, you have to understand your balance sheet of what that cost is for each employee. And to Amy's standpoint, it's one of those things where it does provide a choice where it's like, hey, is the value that we're bringing on a person, which this additional cost, is it worth the additional cost that is going to happen? And as an organization, you have to say yes or no to that. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that is difficult is because as a business owner, you want to keep your costs extremely low and you want to get your profits extremely high. And the higher you can keep those profits, the more opportunities you can provide. And I think the big thing is, if we really address it from just from a personal standpoint, it can be greed. And I think the greed piece has polarized that issue. And then the other part is the people that actually need it and can't get it. That has also polarized the issue. And then I think also the people who have the conversations, they don't really have that much skin in the game in regards to whether or not it pushes either way. But I think there has to be some form of dialogue with this issue where it limits government involvement, but then it also inspires the entrepreneurs who have these, medium-sized organizations to provide healthcare or figure out a creative way to do that, if that is an option that they want to get off. Because that's my biggest thing, is not having as much government involvement within that piece, because we have a free enterprise that we're working towards, and I think is beneficial for our country to have that, where people can create businesses and create jobs. But on the other end of the spectrum, I do understand that, and Sabrina mentioned it as well, is like, it takes a lot of guts to jump out and do this. Like, I'm a full-time entrepreneur with 3 kids, and it's one of those things where it's like, it's extremely scary and extremely difficult. And, my parents and my in-laws think I'm extremely crazy. So
lots of extremes.
Yeah, exactly.
We only have a few more minutes, but Charles, I want to take your suggestion, and I want to take a topic from one of our commenters that I think plays nicely into the stereotypes that we're hitting head on right here of Southern conservatives and San Francisco liberals. Connor Lockwood said, "What role does separation of church and state play in the political landscape? We have a diversity of religious backgrounds here in this Listen First living room conversation. Who wants to tackle separation of church and state, and perhaps Abby get a little bit more of a distinction and a disagreement in the conversation here?"
I would love to hear Devi's point of view on that as well. And I'm not trying to single out, just like,
yeah.
Davey, consider yourself called out. We love your perspective.
So what I have to say to that is, there's more than one place, more than one way to get to the same place. The place of your heart, the place of your soul. And when you're really there, the discernment comes in, the neutrality comes in, and there's no other people telling you how it is. It's the intuition. It's something that comes from within, that guidance, that infinite that exists in all of us, to know the difference between, I don't even want to say right or wrong, because to say right or wrong is to say that there's duality, I guess I will say that there is right and wrong, but there's a difference between good and bad. Good and bad is dualistic, and when you get to that point, when you're really in touch with your spirit, you just know. You just know when you're harming someone. You know that little voice, that there's that ego versus the spirit, or your true essence. And there's a part of you that you're like, oh, but I feel bad doing this. And then the ego can be like, oh, well, whatever, that thought, the mind makes that excuse, like you were talking about, that excuse, like, well, don't worry about it, it'll be okay. And then that which can be stemmed from when dogma gets misconstrued, when the Bible, the Quran, the Guru Granth Sahib, people take, words are limiting to begin with, and when people take it and then the mind, through human interpretation, it can be manipulated into something that it isn't. So I believe in the separation of church and state in the sense where church is assumed to be this dogma, it's been filtered through human interpretation. I don't believe in separation of spirit and government, of spirit and state. So to get to that, it's a whole new shift. We've moved from the Piscean age, which is very dogmatic. We look for someone outside of us to guide us to our spirit. The guru and student, the disciple and student relationship was relevant. Like, we're just transitioning right now. It was relevant like 50 years ago, and now it's shifted. We're in the Aquarian age. It's all about finding that inner guidance, that infinite within ourselves. And so dogma is no longer relevant in this day and age. So to sum up, I do not believe in, I do believe in the separation of church and state, but I do not believe in the separation of church and state, but I do believe in the union of the spirit and state.
Just to clarify, when you're talking about the spirit, is that like an internal spirit of within yourself that you're talking about, or is that some sort of collective spirit?
It's the God within all of us. There is the God within and without, but to experience that connection without, it first comes from within, and through that, the oneness of all is experienced, and then through that, the morality and what's ethical and what's not will naturally flow through our actions.
Davey, would one of the Southern conservatives coming from the more stereotypical traditional Christian perspective have a thought?
I still want to know who you're talking to when you say Southern conservatives.
Yeah, no, right. With all these 10,000 people looking for this, what's your problem?
No, I didn't call out any individual,
yourselves,
but I think Davey has beautifully articulated her perspective, and be curious for one more before we wrap up.
Well, one thing I would say is, with the separation of church and state, I studied a lot of philosophy, and one of the big things that comes up when we talk about spirituality, and then when we talk about faith and these things, when we think about different faiths, there is a philosophy that if my truth says that your truth is a lie, whose truth is truth? And the difficult thing that we have to get beyond is, and I think Davey mentioned it, is a piece of it within the dogma and things like that. Those terms and can offend some people, and some people may say, no, this is my truth and I believe it. So, and we see it all the time within media, and it's just who has the microphone at the time that we have that conversation. And it's really, for me, is really giving the platform for everyone to share their perspective. And like I said before, this is an area where I feel where you should be free to live out the way you want, as long as it's not harming other individuals. And that's really the biggest thing, because we can live in harmony with each other. And there are going to be things where my truth will say your truth is a lie, and that's okay. And your truth can say my truth is a lie, and that's okay. It's a matter of how do we treat each other regarding those philosophical differences. And so you wanted to say something, Pierce?
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Charles. I just added a question here at the last minute because it's scary, right? We're here as Southern conservatives and San Francisco liberals. Will anybody own up to what perceptions you or your neighbors, if it needs to be a friend of mine, have had of Southern conservatives or San Francisco liberals? What has come to mind over time? Maybe it's been totally confirmed by this conversation, maybe not. But what thoughts have you had about the other coast?
I think this conversation has opened my mind and opened my heart to the shift that's really happening. I think that my stereotype of what I thought I would be, in debate with has been broken by this open-mindedness that I'm experiencing here.
Yeah, I think I'll say a couple things, kind of going back to what we were just talking about a minute ago. I would like to apologize for a lot of evangelical Christians who, I'll give the benefit of the doubt and say unknowingly or unintentionally have been just really not good listeners in conversations, especially revolving church and state. I know that's a big issue for a lot of people. A lot of friends of mine think really negatively of evangelical Christians for forcing their views on people and not listening first. And so, I would like to apologize on behalf of people who share my faith, but don't necessarily share my desire, at least my hope, to change the conversation a little bit. And then secondly, I've said before that, I want to change my political affiliation every time I'm in the DMV. And I do work for a Southern Baptist church. And so I am really interested, Davey, in hearing and learning, not necessarily today, but in the future, more about your perspective, because your concept of spirituality is just so different than the framework that of spirituality that I think about. Trying to think about looking into myself for answers about how to engage politically and socially is really hard for me to understand, because when I look in myself, I see somebody who's really selfish, wants everything done my way, who can be argumentative, and in my Southern Baptist Christianese, I would say utterly sinful in and of myself. And so my eyes have just kind of been opened, I guess, if that's the term we're going with, to your perspective, because I don't know a lot about it. And I can't say I understand it fully. But I have really appreciated what you've shared and learning kind of more about your framework.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah,
I would love I would love to be part of that conversation, because as a progressive evangelical who also understands where Davey is coming from, the kingdom of God is within you. That is kind of one of the key bridges in Jesus's teachings between what Davey is talking about and what Amy is talking about. And I think that could be a rich conversation in and of itself. For me, I think my stereotypes of Southern conservatives have been not open-minded, wanting to preserve tradition.
How delicately put, Sabrina. Not open-minded.
Well, just be wanting to preserve tradition and and I personally feel like I actually feel like tradition is a really important thing, but we also need to kind of embrace different points of views. Again, it's a balance. But for me, this conversation it's just humanizing everybody is so powerful. The labels, even if we were all conservative or all progressive on this call, we are all distinct human beings, each with our own life purpose and calling, each with our own experiences and different perspectives. And to try to boil it down to a label is just total folly. So this has been really, really mind and heart expanding for me too.
Cool. So on that note, Sabrina, I'll move to the final question. I would like everybody's perspective on this. In one sentence, share what was most meaningful or valuable to you in the experience of this Listen First living room conversation.
I can go. I think what was most valuable is just being able to speak my mind and not feeling judged. A lot of times on this college campus, I don't know, I'm kind of hesitant to speak what's on my mind and share how I feel. So it was awesome that I felt listened to and not judged for what I believe.
Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah.
I think just having this opportunity to be with all of you guys in this way is a first for me, and it was very impactful. Thank you.
For me, just hearing that I could have possibly opened someone else's eyes and changed the way they perceive things. I haven't really practiced having a voice, and you'll have a lot to share. So having this forum to do that and to know that maybe people do want to hear what I have to say, it's been really powerful. So thank you everyone for the support.
Thank you, Davey, for sharing such a personal, deep perspective of your own journey and your own beliefs.
I guess it's on me. I think this really taps on to my mission. Like I wish it's just a situation where it's just like a season, and like season 1 would be like all of us having this conversation together. And I know we have to keep it rolling and things like that. But I really loved hearing everyone's perspective and then sharing their stories and getting a brief glimpse of what you see and seeing that movie. Even though it was just a trailer, I know there's so many different scenes and things like that, but getting to see the trailer of each and every one of you today was amazing. And, I would love the opportunity to have more conversations like this. And when there's probably not 10,000 people listening around, but actually I would love it, because I think the other 10,000 people would love to see this as well, where it's like, man, I can't wait till they take the gloves off. And it's like, but I love this. But I think I think this is like very like, a blessing to my soul as far as like being able to connect with people. And I know there's such just a depth to each and every one of you that we just tapped on with, the Listen First project and, living room conversations. It's like, it's awesome. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you, Charles.
We talked earlier about how easy it is to augment ourselves into little groups of people that look just like us. And so I really appreciate that all I had to do was show up to this conversation. You made it really easy to kind of jump across, different groups of people and, facilitate the conversation.
Thanks, Amy.
Can I just end with a thought, which is that I just feel so much love for you guys. Like, that's kind of amazing to me that like in an hour and a half, I've met some strangers and I sincerely can say, I love you guys. Like, I really love you guys. So like, I mean, I don't know. That's pretty powerful to me.
Awesome. Awesome. I love it. Well, while we only had a limited time, it was enough to begin building familiarity and relationships that, as you all have acknowledged, enabled this civil discussion of incredibly challenging and personal issues. Such rich dialogue, I think we see every day, is not possible in sound bites. It's not possible with talking points, or especially from behind the keyboard. It happens in conversation, in real, genuine conversation between human beings of grace, humility, and goodwill. And I think it's beautifully demonstrated here today. We are all human beings, as Charles said, with the story, with the whole movie. And today we got just a trailer, but we have this opportunity to learn from one another. And that, as Amy alluded to, remaining in echo chambers with people who look like us and think like us is not only boring, but it's limiting to our development as individuals and as a society. As I've long said, if we hope for a healthy, prosperous nation from sea to shining sea, as we demonstrated tonight, we can't continue to demagogue our fellow Americans because they see the world differently. We must, as each one of you all did, boldly step outside our comfort zones and get to know new people from new places. If Southern conservatives and San Francisco liberals can do it, all of us can. You can too. Please, everybody, sign the Listen First pledge that I will fully listen to and consider your views before sharing my own, that I'll prioritize respect and understanding in conversation and encourage others to do the same. That's on listenfirstproject.org, and there you can also financially support our movement if you're so inclined. The Listen First movement, as we saw today, is rapidly gaining momentum. Just a few hours ago, the Huffington Post published our column on the first two conversations that Sabrina and I produced. When Southern conservatives and San Francisco liberals listen first. So check that out on Huffington Post and share it with your friends. Y'all, together, let's rise above the vitriol and listen first. I firmly believe that we will restore civil discourse, one conversation at a time, conversations just like this, but also conversations on a park bench, in the classroom, in the workplace, maybe one day in Congress, and even in international relations. Thank you so much to you all, our amazing participants, and the now 12,000 of you who joined us live. On behalf of Listen First Project and Living Room Conversations, I'm Pierce Godwin. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Pierce.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.